quietly. Please. Peter. Oh, no. No.
Yet he said not to bring more than 1,000 men. I only had half that with me, but I brought them. It can't be a battle. Half the sigils I saw out there belong to men who'd bite their tongues if they saw a fellow behind you with a knife, and most of the rest are men who'd try to hold your attention if they hadn't paid the knife man in the first place. Seated behind his writing table in his shirt sleeves, Rand wearily pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes. With Borina Caravan left behind, the lamp wicks needed proper trimming, and a faint haze of smoke hung in the air. Besides, he had been awake most of the night, poring over the maps scattered across the table. Maps of southern Altara. No two agreed on very much. If you're going to fight a battle, he told Bashir, who better to pay the butcher's bill than men who want you dead? Anyway, it isn't soldiers who will win this battle. All they have to do is keep anybody from sneaking up on the Ashaman. What do you think of that? Bashir snorted so hard that his heavy mustaches stirred. I think it's a deadly stew, is what I think. Somebody's gonna choke to death on it. The light said it isn't us. And then he laughed, as if that were a fine joke. Luz Theron laughed, too. Chapter 22. Gathering Clouds. Under a steady drizzle, Rand's small army formed columns across the low folded hills facing the Nemerellan peaks, dark and sharp against the western sky. There was no real need to face the direction you intended to travel, but it always felt askew to Rand otherwise. Despite the rain, rapidly thinning gray clouds let through startlingly bright sunshine, or maybe the day only seemed bright, after all the recent gloom. 4 of the columns were headed by Bashir's Saldaeans, bandy-legged unarmored men in short coats standing patiently beside their mounts beneath a small forest of shining lanceheads. The other 5 by blue-coated men with the dragon on their chests, commanded by a short, stocky fellow named Jack Massond. When Massond moved, it was always with surprising quickness, but he was utterly still now, feet planted astride and hands folded behind his back. His men were in place, and so were the defenders and companions, grumpy about being behind infantry. It was the nobles and their folk, mainly, who milled about as if unsure where to go. Thick mud sucked at hooves and boots, and mired cartwheels. Shouted curses rose. It took time to line up nearly 6,000 soaked men, getting wetter by the minute, and that was not counting the supply carts and the remounts. Rand had donned his finest so he would stand out at a glance. A lick with the power had polished the Dragon Scepter's spearhead to mirror brightness, and another had burnished the crown of swords so the gold gleamed. The gilded dragon buckle of his sword belt caught the light, and so did the thread of gold embroidery that covered his blue silk coat. For a moment, he regretted giving away the gems that once had decked his sword's hilt and scabbard. The dark boarhide was serviceable, but any armsman could have worn that. Let men know who he was. Let the Seanchan know who had come to destroy them. Sitting Taidai-Shar on a broad flat, he impatiently watched the nobles roil about on the hills. A little way off on the flat, Gedwin and Rochide sat their saddles in front of their men, all formed into a precise box, dedicated in the front rank, soldiers lined up behind. They looked ready to parade. As many had gray hair, or nearly none, as were young. Several were as young as Hopwill or more, but every one was strong enough to make a gateway. That had been a requirement. Flynn and Deshiva waited behind Rand in a casual cluster with Adley and Moore, Hopwill and Narishma, and a rigid pair of mounted bannermen, one Tyran and one Kyrienin, their breastplates and helmets and even their steel-backed gauntlets buffed and polished till they shone. The crimson banner of light and the long white dragon banner hung limp and dripping. Rand had assumed the power in his tent, where his momentary stagger would not be seen, and the sparse rain failed by an inch to touch him or his horse. The taint on Saidin felt especially heavy today, a thick, foul oil that oozed into his pores and stained his bones deep, stained his soul. He had thought himself accustomed to the vileness, after a fashion, yet today it was nauseating, stronger than the frozen fire and molten cold of Saidin itself. He held on to the source as often as possible now, accepting the vileness to avoid the new sickness of seizing it. It could be deadly if he let sickness distract him from that struggle. Maybe it was connected to the dizzy spells somehow. Light, he could not go mad yet, and he could not die. Not yet. There was too much still to be done. He pressed his left leg against Tidashar's flank just to feel the long bundle strapped beneath stirrup leather and scarlet saddlecloth. Every time he did that, something wriggled across the outside of the void. Anticipation, and maybe a touch of fear. Well trained, the gelding started to turn left, and Rand had to rein him back. When would the nobles sort themselves out? He ground his teeth in impatience. He could remember as a boy hearing men laugh that when rain fell in sunshine, the Dark One was beating Semirhage. Some of that laughter had been uneasy, though, and scrawny old Sen Bui would always snarl that Semirhage would be smarting and angry after that, and come for small boys who did not keep out of their elders' way. That had been enough to send Rand running, when he was little. He wished Semirhage would come for him now, right that instant. He would make her weep. Nothing makes Semirhage weep, Lews Therin muttered. She gives tears to others, but she has none for herself. Rand laughed softly. If she came today, he would make her weep. Her and the rest of the Forsaken together, if they came today. Most assuredly, he would make the Shonchan weep. Not everyone was pleased with the orders he had given. Sunamon's oily smile vanished when he thought Rand did not see. Torion had a flask in his saddlebags, no doubt brandy, or maybe several flasks, because he drank steadily and never appeared to run dry. Samaradrid and Marcolin and Tahara each appeared in front of Rand to protest the numbers with somber faces. A few years before, close on 6,000 men would have been army enough for any war. But they had seen armies in the tens of thousands now, hundreds of thousands, as in Arthur Hawkwing's day. And to go against the Shonchan, they wanted far more. He sent them away disgruntled. They did not understand that 50-odd Ashaman were as big a hammer as anyone could wish for. Rand wondered what they would have said had he told them he was hammer enough by himself. He had considered doing this by himself. It might come to that yet. Wyraman came. He did not like having to take orders from Bashir, or the fact that they were going into mountains. Very hard to mount a decent charge in mountains. Or several other things. Rand was certain there were at least several more that Rand did not let him utter. The Saldaean seems to believe I should ride on the right flank, Wyraman muttered disparagingly. He twisted his shoulders, as though the right flank were a great insult for some reason. And the foot, my Lord Dragon. Really, I think you should get your men ready, Rand said coldly. Part of the chill was the effect of floating in emotionless emptiness. Or you won't be on any flank. He meant that he would leave the man behind if he were not ready in time. Surely such a fool could not make much trouble left in this remote spot with only a few armsmen. Rand would be back before he could ride to anything larger than a village. Blood drained from Wyraman's face, though. As my Lord Dragon commands, he said, briskly for him, and whirling his horse away before the words were well out of his mouth. His mount was a tall, deep-chested bay today. The pale lady Ailil reined to a stop in front of Rand, accompanied by the high lady Anayala, a strange pair to be in company, and not just because their nations hated one another.
Hey, Fo, how you
Ailil
doing?
was tall for a Carianan woman, if only for a Kyrianan, and everything about her was dignity and precision, from the arch of her eyebrow to the turn of her red-gloved wrist to the way her pearl-collared rain cape lay spread across the rump of her smoke-gray mare.
Hey, it still smokes.
Unlike Samaradrid or Markelin, Wyraman or Tehera, she did not so much as blink at the sight of raindrops sliding down nothing around him. Anaila did blink, and gasp, and titter behind her hand. Anaila was willowy and darkly beautiful, her rain cape collared with rubies and embroidered with gold besides, but there any resemblance to Ailil ended. Anaila was all mincing elegance and simpers. When she bowed, her white gelding did too, bending its forelegs. The prancing animal was showy,
Oh, shit.
but Rand suspected it had no bottom.
That's
Like
good
its
that you're
mistress.
filling up.
My Lord Dragon, Ailil said, I must make one more protest against my inclusion in this expedition. Her voice was coolly neutral, if not exactly unfriendly. I will send my retainers where you command and when, but I have no desire at all to be in the thick of a battle. Oh no, Anaila added, with a delicate shudder. Even her tone simpered. Nasty things, battles. So my master of the horse says.
Excuse me.
Surely you won't really make this go, my Lord Dragon. We've heard you have a particular care for women, haven't we, Ailil? Rand was so astonished that the void collapsed and Sayadine vanished. Raindrops began to trickle through his hair and seep through his coat. But for a moment, clutching his saddle's high pommel to hold himself upright, seeing 4 women instead of 2, he was too stunned to notice. How much did they know? They had heard. How many people knew? How did anyone know? Light. Rumor had him killing Morghese, Elaine, Coliver. 100 women, probably, and each in a worse way than the last.
Down.
He swallowed against the urge to sick up.
That sucks.
That was only partly
That sucks.
Sayadine's fault. Burn
Definitely
me.
a
How many spies are there
sensitive
watching
area.
me? The thought was a growl. The dead watch, Luce Theron whispered. The dead never close their eyes. Rand shivered. I do try to be careful of women, he told them when he could speak. Faster than a man, and for half the reason. That's why I want to keep you close the next few days. But if you really dislike the idea so much, I could tell one of the Ashaman. You'd be safe at the Black Tower. Anaila squeaked prettily, but her face went gray. Thank you. No, Ailil said after a moment, absolutely calm. I suppose I had best confer with my lance captain about what to expect. But she paused in turning her mare away, and regarded Rand with a sidelong look. My brother Toram is impetuous, my Lord Dragon. Even rash. I am not. Anaila smiled much too sweetly at Rand and actually wriggled slightly before following. But once she faced away from him, she dug in her heels and worked her jewel-handled quirt, quickly passing the other woman.
Oh, shit.
That white gelding showed a surprising turn of speed. At last, all was ready. The columns formed, snaking back over the low hills. Begin, Rand told Gedwin, who wheeled his horse and began barking orders to his men. The 8 dedicated rode forward and dismounted on the ground they had memorized, facing the mountains. One of them looked familiar. A grizzled fellow whose pointed Tyran beard appeared odd on his wrinkled countryman's face. 8 vertical lines of sharp blue light turned and became openings that showed slightly different views of a long and sparsely wooded mountain valley rising to a steep pass. In Altara. In the Venir Mountains. Kill them, Luce Theron wept pleadingly. They're too dangerous to live. Without thought, Rand suppressed the voice. Another man channeling often brought that reaction from Luce Theron, or even a man who could. He no longer wondered why. Rand muttered a command, and Flynn blinked in surprise before hurrying to join the line and weave a 9th gateway. None was as large as Rand could make, but any would pass a cart, if closely. He had intended to do that himself, but he did not want a chance of seizing Saidin again in front of everyone. He noticed Gedwin and Rochide watching him, wearing identical knowing smiles. And Dashiva as well, frowning, lips moving as he talked to himself. Was it his imagination, or was Narishma eyeing him askance too? And Atli? More? Rand shivered before he could stop himself. Mistrust of Gedwin and Rochide was simple sense, but was he coming down with what Nynaeve had called the dreads? A kind of madness? A crippling dark suspicion of everyone and everything? There had been a Copland, Benley,
Hell
who
yeah.
thought everybody was
Fire.
scheming against him.
That's always
He had
good
starved to
when
death
kids
when
treat
Rand
you
was a
like
boy,
that.
refusing to eat for fear of poison.
I mean, he raised them right.
Ducking low on Tidashar's neck, Rand heeled the gelding through the largest gateway. Flynn says it happened, but he would have ridden through one made by Gedwin right then. He was the first onto Altaran soil. The others followed quickly, the Ashaman first of all. Dashiva started in Rand's direction, frowning, and Narishma too, but Gedwin immediately began directing his soldiers. One by one, they rushed forward, opened a gateway, and darted through, dragging their mounts behind them. Ahead up the valley, bright flashes of light told of gateways opening and closing. The Ashaman could travel short distances without first memorizing the ground they left from, and cover ground far easier than riding. In short order, only Gedwin and Rochide remained, aside from the dedicated holding the gateways. The others would be fanning out westward, searching for Shanchan. The Saldaeans were through from Ilion and mounting. Legion men spread into the trees at a trot, crossbows held ready.
Hell yeah.
In this
fire.
country, they could move as fast afoot as men on horseback. As the rest of the army began emerging, Rand rode up the valley in the direction the Ashaman had gone. Mountains rose high behind him, a wall fronting the deep. But west, the peaks ran almost to Abu Dar. He quickened the gelding's pace to a canter. Bashir caught him before he reached the pass. The man's bay was small. Most of the Saldaeans rode small horses, but quick. No Shanchan here, it seems, he said almost idly, stroking his mustaches with a knuckle. But there could have been. Denobi is likely to have my head on a pike soon enough for following a live dragon reborn. Much more a dead one. Rand scowled. Maybe he could take Flynn to watch his back, and Narishma, and Flynn had saved his life. The man had to be true. Men could change, though. And Narishma? Even after... He felt cold at the risk he had taken. Not the dreads. Narishma had proved true, but it still had been a mad risk. As mad as running from stairs he was not even sure were real. Running to where he had no notion what was waiting. Bashir was right, but Rand did not want to talk about it further. The slopes leading up into the pass were bare stone and boulders of all sizes, but among the natural stone lay weathered pieces of what must have once been a huge statue. Some were just recognizable as worked stone, others more so. A beringed hand, nearly big as his chest, gripping a sword hilt with a broken stub of blade wider than his hand. A great head. A woman with cracks across her face and a crown that seemed to be made of upthrusting daggers, some still whole. Who do you think she was? He asked. A queen, of course. Even if merchants or scholars had worn crowns in some distant time, only rulers and generals earned statues. Bashir twisted in his saddle to study the head before speaking. A queen of Shiota, I'll wager, he said finally. Not older. I saw a statue made in Aharon once, and it was so worn you couldn't say whether it was man or woman. A conqueror, they wouldn't have shown her with a sword. And I seem to recall Shiota gave a crown like that to rulers who expanded the borders. Maybe they called it the Crown of Swords, eh? A brown sister might be able to tell you more. It isn't important, Rand told him irritably. They did look like swords. Bashir went on anyway, graying eyebrows lowered, gravely serious. I expect thousands cheered her, called her the hope of Shiota. Maybe even believed she was. In her time, she might have been as feared and respected as Utter Hawkwing was later. But now, even the Brown sisters may not know her name. When you die, people begin to forget who you were, what you did, or tried to do. Everybody dies eventually, and everybody is forgotten eventually. But there's no bloody point dying before your time comes. I don't intend to, Rand said sharply. He knew where he was meant to die, if not when. He thought he did. The corner of his eye caught motion, back down where bare stone gave way to brush and a few small trees. 50 paces away, a man stepped into the open and raised a bow, smoothly drawing fletchings to cheek. Everything seemed to happen at once. Snarling, Rand hauled Tidashar around, watching the archer adjust to follow. He seized Saidin, and sweet life and filth poured into him together. His head spun. There were two archers. Bile rose in his throat as he fought wild, uncontrolled surges of the power that tried to sear him to the bone and freeze his flesh solid. He could not control them. It was all he could do to stay alive. Desperately, he fought to clear his sight, to be able to see well enough to weave the flows he could barely form, with nausea flooding him as strongly as the power. He thought he heard Bashir shout. Two archers loosed. Rand should have died. At that range, a boy could have hit his target. Maybe being Taviran saved him. As the archer let fly, a covey of gray-winged quail burst up almost at his feet, uttering piercing whistles. Not enough to throw off an experienced man, and indeed the fellow only flinched a hair. Rand felt the wind of the arrow's passage against his cheek. Fireballs the size of fists suddenly struck the archer. He screamed as his arm spun away, hand still gripping the bow. Another took off his left leg at the knee. He fell shrieking. Leaning out of his saddle, Rand vomited onto the ground. His stomach tried to heave up every meal he had ever eaten. The void inside Dean left with a sickening wrench. It was nearly more than he could manage not to fall. When he could sit upright again, he took the white linen handkerchief Bashir silently offered and wiped his mouth. The Saldaean frowned with concern, as well he might. Rand's stomach wanted to find more to spew out. He thought his face must be pale. He drew a deep breath. Losing Saidin that way could kill you. But he could still sense the source. At least Saidin had not burned him out. At least he could see properly. There was only one Davram Bashir. But the illness seemed a little worse each time he seized Saidin. Let's see if there's enough of this fellow left to talk, he told Bashir. There was not. Rochad was on his knees, calmly searching through the corpse's torn, blood-stained coat. Besides his missing arm and leg, the dead man had a blackened hole as big as his head all the way through his chest. It was Egan Padros. His sightless eyes stared at the sky in surprise. Gedwin ignored the body at his feet, studying Rand instead, as cold as Rochad. Both men held Saidin. Surprisingly, Luce Theron only moaned. In a clatter of hooves on stone, Flynn and Narishma came galloping up the rise, followed by nearly 100 Saldaeans. As they came close, Rand could feel the power in the grizzled old man and the younger, maybe as much as they could hold. They had both leaped up in strength since Dumai's Wells. That was the way of it with men. Women seemed to gain smoothly, but men suddenly jumped. Flynn was stronger than Gedwin or Rochide, either one, and Narishma not far behind. For the time being, there was no way to know how it would end. None came close to matching Rand, though. Not yet, anyway. There was no way to tell what time would bring. Not the dreads. It seems it's well we decided to follow you, my Lord Dragon. Gedwin's voice assumed concern, just shy of mocking. Are you suffering from a tender stomach this morning? Rand just shook his head. He could not take his eyes from Pedrus's face. Why? Because he had conquered Ilion? Because the man had been loyal to Lord Brand? With a loud exclamation, Rochide ripped a wash-leather pouch from Pedrus's coat pocket and upended it. Bright golden coins spilled onto the stony ground, bouncing and clinking. 30 crowns, he growled. Tarvalin crowns. No doubt who paid him. He snatched a coin and tossed it up for Rand, but Rand made no effort to catch it, and it glanced off his arm. There's plenty of Tarvalan coin to be found, Bashir said calmly. Half the men in this valley have a few in their pockets. I do myself. Gedwin and Rothschild swiveled to look at him. Bashir smiled behind his thick mustaches, or at least showed teeth. But some of the Saldaeans shifted uneasily in their saddles and fingered belt pouches. Up where the pass leveled off for a bit between steep mountain slopes, a slash of light rotated into a gateway, and a top-knotted Shanaran in a plain black coat trotted through, pulling his horse behind him. It appeared the first Shonchan had been found, and not too far away if the man was back so quickly. Time to move, Rand told Bashir. The man nodded, but he did not stir. Instead, he studied the two Ashaman standing near Padros. They ignored him. What do we do with him? Gedwin demanded, gesturing to the corpse. We ought to send him back to the witches, at least. Leave him, Rand replied. Are you ready to kill now? Lews Theron asked. He did not sound insane at all. Not yet, Rand thought. Soon. Digging his heels into Tadashar's flanks, he galloped back down toward his army. Dashiva and Flynn followed closely, and Bashir and the 100 Saldaeans. They were all looking around as if they expected another attempt on his life. To the east, black clouds were building among the peaks. Another Cimaros storm. Soon. The hilltop camp was well laid out, with a meandering stream close by for water and good lines of sight to the likeliest ways into the long mountain meadow. Asid Bakun did not feel pride in the camp. During 30 years in the ever-victorious army, he had made hundreds of camps. He would as soon have felt pride in walking across a room without falling down. Nor did he feel pride in where he was. 30 years serving the Empress, might she live forever? And while there had been the occasional rebellion by some mad upstart with eyes on the crystal throne, the bulk of those years had been spent preparing for this. For 2 generations, while the great ships were built to carry the return, the ever-victorious army had trained and prepared. Bakun certainly had been proud when he learned he was to be one of the forerunners. Surely he could be forgiven dreams of retaking the lands stolen from Arthur Hawkwing's rightful heirs, even wild dreams to completing this new consolidation before the Karen came. Not such a wild dream after all, as it turned out, but not at all the way he had imagined. A returning patrol of 50 Tarabaner Lancers rode up the hillside, red and green stripes painted across their solid breastplates, veils of mail hiding their thick mustaches. They rode well, and even fought well, when they had decent leaders. More than 10 times as many were already among the cook fires or down the picket lines tending their mounts, and 3 patrols were still out. Bakun had never expected to find himself with well over half his command descendants of thieves. And ashamed of it. They would look you straight in the eyes. The patrol's commander bowed low to him as their muddy-legged horses passed, but many of the others went on talking in their peculiar accents, speaking too fast for Bakun to understand without listening hard. They had peculiar notions of discipline, too. Shaking his head, Bakun strode across to the Suldam's large tent. Larger than his, of necessity. 4 of them were sitting on stools outside, in their dark blue dresses with the forked lightning on the skirts, enjoying the sun during this break in the storms. Those were rare enough now. The gray-clad Damani sat at their feet, with Nereth braiding her pale hair. Talking to her as well, all of them joining in and laughing softly. The bracelet on the end of the silvery Edam's leash lay on the ground. Bakun grunted sourly. He had a favorite wolfhound back home, and even talked to him sometimes, but he never expected Nip to carry on a conversation. Is she well? He asked Nereth, not for the first time, or the 10th. Is everything well with her? The Damani dropped her eyes and went silent. She is quite well, Captain Bakun. A square-faced woman, Nereth put the proper degree of respect into her voice, and not a whisker beyond. but she stroked the Damani's head soothingly while she talked. Whatever the indisposition, it is gone now. A small thing in any case. Nothing to worry about. The Damani was trembling. Bakun grunted again, not far from the answer he had received before. Something had been wrong, though, back in Ebudar, and not just with this Damani. The Suldam had all been as tight-lipped as clams, and the blood would not say anything, of course, not to the likes of him. But he had heard too many whispers. They said the Damani were all sick or insane. Light, he had not seen a single one used around Ebudar once the city was secured. Not even for a victory display of skylight. And who had ever heard the like of that? Well, I hope he began, and cut off as a rocket appeared, sweeping through the eastern pass. Its great leathery wings beat powerfully for height, and right above the hill it suddenly tilted and cut a tight circle. One wingtip pointed almost straight down. A thin red streamer fell away under the weight of a light ball. Bakun swallowed a curse. Flyers were always shilling off, but if this pair injured one of his men delivering their scouting report, he would have their hides no matter who he had to face to get them. He would not have wanted to fight without flyers to scout, but they were coddled like some blood's favorite pet. Arrow straight, the streamer plummeted. The lead weight struck the ground and bounced on the crest, almost beside the tall, thin message pole, which was too long to lower unless there was a message to send. Besides, when it was let down, somebody was always stepping a horse on the thing and breaking the joins. Bakun strode straight to his tent, but his first lieutenant was already waiting with the mud-stained streamer and the message tube. Tyrus was a bony man, a head taller than him, with an unfortunate scrap of beard clinging to the point of his chin. The report rolled up in the thin metal tube. On a slip of paper Bakun could almost see through, was written simply. He had never been forced to ride on Rakan or Torakan, the light be thanked, and the Empress, might she live forever, be praised. But he doubted it was easy to handle a pen in a saddle strapped to the back of a flying lizard. What it said made him flip open the lid of his small camp desk and write hurriedly. There's a force not 10 miles east of here, he told Tyrus. 5 or 6 times our number. Flyers exaggerated sometimes, but not often by much. How had that many penetrated these mountains so far without being spotted before? He had seen the coast to the east, and he wanted his burial prayers paid before he tried a landing there. Burn his eyes, the flyers boasted they would see a fleeing move anywhere in the range. No reason to think they know we're here, but I'd not mind a few reinforcements. Tyrus laughed. We'll give them a brush of the Damani, and that will be that if they outnumber us by 20 times.
Dropped it.
His only real fault was a touch of overconfidence. A good soldier, though. And if they have a few Aes Sedai, Bakun said quietly, hardly stumbling over the name as he stuffed the flyer's report back into the tube with his own brief message. He had not really believed anyone could let those women run free. Tyrus's face showed that he remembered the tales about an Aes Sedai weapon. The red streamer floated behind him as he ran with the message tube. Soon enough, tube and streamer were attached to the tip of the message pole, a tiny breeze stirring the long red strip 15 paces above the hill crest. The Rakan soared toward it, along the valley, outstretched wings still as death. Abruptly, one of the flyers swung down from the saddle and hung, upside down, below the Rakan's trailing claws. It made Bakun's stomach hurt to watch. But her hand closed on the streamer, the pole flexed, then vibrated back upright as the message tube pulled free of the clip, and she scrambled back up as the creature climbed in slow circles. Bakun thankfully put Rakan and flyers out of his mind as he surveyed the valley. Broad and long, nearly flat except for this hill, and surrounded by steeped wooded slopes, only a goat could enter, except by the passes in his sight. With the Damani, he could cut anybody to pieces before they managed to try attacking across that muddy meadow. He had passed word along, though. If the enemy came straight on, they would arrive before any possible reinforcements, by 3 days at best. How had they come this far unseen? He had missed the last battles of the consolidation by 200 years, but some of those rebellions had not been small. 2 years fighting on Marandala, 30,000 dead, and 50 times that shipped back to the mainland as property. Taking notice of the strange kept a soldier alive. Ordering the camp struck and all signs of it cleared, he began moving his command to the forested slopes. Dark clouds were massing in the east. Another of those cursed storms was coming. Chapter 23. Fog of War, Storm of Battle. No rain fell, for the moment. Rand guided Ibashar around an uprooted tree lying across the slope and frowned down at a dead man sprawled on his back behind the tree trunk. The fellow was short and blocky, his face creased and his armor, all overlapping plates, lacquered blue and green. But staring
I didn't have to start a new one. I just had to reconnect. And we're back. I'm not sure what happened with that. Yep, we're back. I'm not sure what happened with my laptop. It just kind of froze up to where I had to turn it completely off and then right back on again. I don't know why I did that. Oh, is that what did it? You gave the iPad a deadly look? Yeah. Now we can start number 2. Oh, what happened to the music? Give me a second. Or the book. I don't know why it stopped.
Oh, let me too, Rand thought sadly. I can't afford to listen, but how do you
I
shut
know
them
I
up?
stopped. I stopped it whenever
Luz Theron began weeping
it
for his
started. I
lost
forgot it
Ilyena.
started again.
A great
Yeah,
victory,
it's distracting.
Wyerman intoned behind Rand, then muttered, but small honor in it. The old ways are best. Mud liberally decorated Rand's coat, yet surprisingly, Wyerman appeared as pristine as he had back on the Silver Road. His helmet and armor shone. How had he managed? The Tarabanners charged, at the end, lances and courage against the One Power, and Wyerman had led his own charge to break them. Without orders, and followed by every tyrant save the defenders, even a half-drunk Torian, surprisingly. By Samaradrid and Gregorin Pana, too, with most of the Karienin and Illianers. Standing still had been hard by that time, and every man wanted to come to grips with something he actually could come to grips with. The Ashaman could have done it faster, if somewhat more messily. Rand had taken no part in the fighting, except to sit his saddle where men could see him. He had been afraid to seize the power. He did not dare display weakness for them to catch. Not a scrap. Luz Theron gibbered with horror at the very idea. Equally surprising as Wyerman's unsullied coat, Anila rode with him, and for once not simpering. Her face was pinched and disapproving. Strangely, it did not spoil her looks nearly so much as her unctuous smiles did. She had not joined the charge herself, of course, any more than Ailil. But Anila's master of the horse had, and the man was most definitely dead, with a Tarabanner lance through his chest. She did not like that one bit. But why did she accompany Wyerman? Just tyrants flocking together? Maybe. She had been with Sunaman, the last Rand had seen. Bashir walked his bay up the slope, picking his way around the dead while seeming to pay them no more mind than he did a splintered tree trunk or a burning stump. His helmet hung from his saddle, and his gauntlets were stuffed behind his sword belt. He was mud all down his right side, and his horse as well. Arakom's gone, he said. Flynn tried healing him, but I don't think Arakom wanted to live like that. There's near 50 dead so far, and some of the rest might not survive. Anila paled. Rand had seen her near Arakom, emptying herself. Dead commoners did not affect her so much. Rand felt a moment of pity, not for her, and not very much for Arakom. For Min, though she was safely back in Carrion. Min had foretold Arakom's death from one of her viewings, and Gwayam and Marakon's too. Whatever she had seen, Rand hoped it had not been anywhere near the reality. Most of the soldiers were off scouting again, but down in the broad meadow, gateways woven by Gedwin's dedicated were spilling out the supply carts and the remounts. The men coming with them gaped as soon as they were clear enough to see. The muddy ground was not so well plowed as the mountainside, yet blackened furrows, 2 paces wide and 50 long, carved through the brown grass, and gaping holes a horse might not be able to leap. They had not found the Damani so far. Rand thought there had to be only one. More would have done considerably greater damage under the circumstances. Men moved around a number of small fires where water boiled for tea, among other things. For once, Tyrants, Karienin, and Illianers mingled. Not just the commoners. Samaradrid was sharing his saddle flask with Gwayam, who wearily rubbed a hand over his bald head. Marakan and Kirill Drapaneos, a stork of a man whose square-cut beard looked odd on his narrow face, were squatting on their heels near one of the fires. Playing cards, by the look of it. Torian had a whole circle of laughing Karienin lordlings around him, though they might have been less amused by his jokes than by the way he swayed and rubbed at his potato nose. The Legion men kept apart, but they had taken in the volunteers who had followed Padros to the Banner of Light. That lot seemed more eager than anyone since learning how Padros died. Blue-coated Legion men were showing them how to change direction without falling apart like a gaggle of geese. Flynn was among the wounded with Adley and Moore and Hopwell. Narishma could heal little more than minor cuts, no better than Rand. And Deshiva, not even that. Gedwin and Rochide stood talking well apart from anyone else, holding their horses by the reins atop the hill in the middle of the valley. The hill where they had expected to catch the Shonchan by surprise when they rushed out of gateways surrounding it. Near 50 dead and more to come, but it would have been above 200 without Flynn and the rest who could manage healing to one degree or another. Gedwin and Rochide had not wanted to dirty their hands and grimaced when Rand drove them to it. One of the dead was a soldier, and another soldier, a round-faced Kyrianan, sat slumped beside a fire with a dazed look that Rand hoped came from being tossed through the air by the ground erupting almost under his feet. Down there on the furrowed flats, Ailil was conferring with her lance captain, a pale little man called Denharid. Their horses stood nearly touching, and occasionally they looked up the mountain toward Rand. Were they scheming? "We'll do better next time," Bashir murmured. He ran his gaze around the valley, then shook his head. "The worst mistake is to make the same one twice, and we won't." Wireman heard him and repeated the same thing, but using 20 times the words, and flowery enough for a garden in spring, without admitting there had been any mistakes, certainly on his part. He avoided Rand's mistakes with equal adroitness. Rand nodded, his mouth tight. Next time they would do better. They had to, unless he wanted to leave half his men buried in these mountains. Right then, he was wondering what to do with the prisoners. Most of those who escaped death on the mountainside had managed to withdraw through the trees that remained standing. With amazingly good order, considering, Bashir claimed. Yet they were unlikely to be much threat now. Not unless they had the Damani with them. But 100 or so men sat huddled on the ground, stripped of weapons and armor, under the watchful eyes of 24 mounted companions and defenders. Tarabanners for the most part, they had not fought like men driven to it by conquerors. A fair number held their heads up and jeered at their guards. Gedwin had wanted to kill them after putting them to the question. Wireman did not care whether they had their throats slit, but he considered torture a waste of time. None of them would know anything useful, he maintained. There was not a one nobly born. Rand glanced at Bashir. Wireman was still going on sonorously. "Sweep these mountains clean for you, my Lord Dragon. We'll trample them beneath our hooves, and..." Anayala was nodding grim approval. "6 up and half a dozen down," Bashir said softly. He scraped mud from one of his thick mustaches with a fingernail. "Or as some of my tenants say, what you gain on the swings, you lose on the roundabouts." What in the light was a roundabout? A great help that was. And then one of Bashir's patrols made matters worse. The 6 men came prodding a prisoner along the slope ahead of their horses with the butts of their lances. She was a black-haired woman in a torn and dirty dark blue dress with red panels on the breast and skirts bearing forked lightning. Her face was dirty too and tear-streaked. She stumbled and half fell, but the prodding was more gesture than actual touching. She glared scornfully at her captors, even spitting once. She sneered at Rand, too. "Did you hurt her?" he demanded. A strange question, perhaps, about an enemy after what had happened in this valley. About a Suldam. But it popped out. "Not any of us, my Lord Dragon," the gruff-faced patrol leader said. "We found her like this." Scratching his chin through a black flowing beard, he eyed Bashir as if for support. "She claims we killed her Jilla. A pet dog or cat or some such, the way she carries on. Her name's Nerith. We got that much out of her." The woman turned and snarled at him again. Rand sighed. Not a pet dog. No, that name did not belong on the list, but he could hear the litany of names reciting itself in his head, and Jilla the Damani was there. Luce Theron moaned for his Ilyena. Her name also was on the list. Rand thought it had a right. "This is a Shonchan Aes Sedai?" Anayala asked suddenly, leaning over the pommel of her saddle to peer hard at Nerith. Nerith spat at her as well, eyes widening in outrage. Rand explained the little he knew of Suldam, that they controlled women who could channel with the aid of a leash and collar terangrial, but could not themselves channel, and to his surprise, the dainty, simpering high lady said coldly, "If my Lord Dragon feels constrained, I'll hang her for him." Nerith spat at her again, contemptuously this time. No shortfall of courage there. "No," Rand growled, like the things people would do to get on his good side. Or maybe Anayala had been closer to her master of the horse than was considered proper. The man had been stout and balding, and a commoner. That counted heavily with Tyrans. But women did have strange tastes in men. He knew that for a pure fact. "As soon as we're ready to move again," he told Bashir, "turn the men down there loose." Taking prisoners along when he launched his next attack was out of the question, and leaving 100 men, 100 now, more later for sure, leaving them to follow with the supply carts risked 50 kinds of mischief. They could cause no trouble left behind. Even the fellows who had gotten away on horseback could not carry a warning faster than he could travel. Bashir shrugged faintly. He thought it might be so, but then again there was always the odd chance. Strange things happened, even without a Taviran around. Wyraman and Anayala opened their mouths almost together, faces set in protest, but Rand pressed on. "I've spoken, and it's done. We'll keep the woman, though, and any more women we capture." "Burn my soul," Wyraman exclaimed. "Why?" The man appeared dumbfounded, and for that matter, Bashir gave a startled jerk of his head. Anayala's mouth twisted in contempt before she managed to turn it to a simpering smile for the Lord Dragon. Plainly, she thought him too soft to send a woman off with the others. They would have hard walking in this terrain, not to mention short rations, and the weather was not weather to turn a woman out in. "I have enough Aes Sedai against me without sending Suldam back to their trade," he told them. The Light knew that was true. They nodded, if Wyraman was slow about it. Bashir looked relieved, Anayala disappointed. But what to do with the woman, and any more he captured? He did not intend to turn the Black Tower into a prison. The Aiel could hold them, except that the Wise Ones might slit their throats the moment his back was turned. What about the sisters that Matt was taking to Camelin with Elaine, though?
Finish this match real quick.
"When this is done, I'll hand her over to some Aes Sedai I choose. They might see it as a gesture of goodwill, a little honey to sweeten their having to accept his protection." No sooner were the words out of his mouth than Nerith's face went dead white, and she screamed at the top of her lungs. Howling without cease, she flung herself down the slope, scrabbling over downed trees, falling and scrambling back up. "Bloody... catch her!" Rand snapped, and the Saldaean patrol leaped after the woman, jumping their mounts across the tree-littered slope, careless of broken legs and necks. Still wailing, she dodged and darted among the horses with even less care. In the mouth of the easternmost pass, a gateway opened in a flash of silver light. A black-coated soldier pulled his horse through, jumped to the saddle as the gateway winked out, and put his mount to a gallop toward the hilltop where Gedwin and Rochide waited. Rand watched impassively. In his head, Lews Therin snarled of killing all the Ashaman before it was too late. By the time the three of them started up the slope toward Rand, 4 of the Saldaeans had Nerith down on the ground, binding her hand and foot. It took 4, the way she thrashed and bit at them, and an amused Bashir was offering odds on whether she might not overcome them instead. Anayala muttered something about cracking the woman's head. Did she mean cracking it open? Rand frowned at her. The soldier between Gedwin and Rochide glanced at Nerith uneasily as they rode past. Rand vaguely remembered seeing him at the Black Tower, the day he first handed out the silver swords and gave Taim the very first dragon pin. He was a young man, Varl Nensen by name, still wearing a transparent veil to cover his thick mustaches. He had not hesitated when he found himself facing his countrymen, though. Allegiance was to the Black Tower and the Dragon Reborn, now, so Taim always said. The second part of that always sounded an afterthought. "You may have the honor of making your report to the Dragon Reborn, Soldier Nensen," Gedwin said. wryly. Nenson sat up straight in his saddle.
That one took forever. Had
My
to
Lord
go
Dragon,
all 3 rounds.
he barked, slapping fist to chest. There's more of them about 30 miles west, my Lord Dragon. 30 miles was as far as Rand had told the scouts to go before returning. What good if one soldier found Shanshan while the rest kept moving ever farther west? Maybe half what we're here, Nenson went on. And his dark eyes flickered toward Nerith again. She was tied now, the Saldaeans struggling to get her over a horse. And I saw no sign of women, my Lord Dragon. Bashir squinted at the sky. Dark clouds lay in a blanket from mountain peak to mountain peak, but the sun should still be high. Time to feed the men before the rest return, he said, nodding in satisfaction. Nerith had managed to sink her teeth into a Saldaean's wrist and was hanging on like a badger. Feed them quick, Rand said irritably. Would every Suldam he captured be as difficult? Very likely.
Coming undone.
Light, what if they took a Damani? I don't want to spend all winter in these mountains. Jilla the Damani. He could not erase a name once it went onto that list. The dead are never silent, Luce Theron whispered. The dead never sleep. Rand rode down toward the fires. He did not feel like eating. From the point of a thrusting shoulder of stone, Furik Kharid carefully studied the forested mountains rising all around him, sharp peaks like dark fangs. His horse, a tall, dappled gelding, stiffened his ears as though catching a sound he had missed. But otherwise, the animal was still. Every so often, Kharid had to stop and wipe the lens of his looking glass. A light rain fell from a gray morning sky. His helmet's 2 black plumes were bent over instead of standing straight, and water ran down his back. A light rain compared to yesterday, anyway, and probably compared to tomorrow. Or this afternoon, perhaps. Thunder rumbled ominously in the south. Kharid's concern had nothing to do with weather, though. Below him, the last of 2,300 men snaked through the winding passes, men gathered from 4 outposts. Well-mounted, reasonably well-led, yet a bare 200 were Shanshan, and just 2 besides himself wore the red and green of the Guard. Most of the remainder were Taraboners. He knew their mettle, but a good third were Amadisians and Altarans, too new to their oaths for any to be sure how they would stand up. Some Altarans and Amadisians had switched allegiance 2 or 3 times already. Tried to, anyway. People this side of the Arath Ocean had no shame. A dozen Suldam rode near the front of the column, and he wished all 12 had leashed Damanis walking by their horses instead of only 2. 50 paces farther on, the 10 men of the spearhead were watching the slopes above them, though not as carefully as they should have. Too many men who rode spearhead relied on the forward scouts to find any dangers. Kharid made a note to speak to them personally. They would do their duties properly after that, or he would send them to the labor levies. Arakan appeared in the east ahead, skimming low over the treetops, twisting and turning to follow the curves of the land like a man running his hand down a woman's back. Peculiar. Morat Arakan, flyers, always liked to soar high unless the sky was actually full of lightning. Kharid lowered the looking glass to watch. Maybe we'll finally get another scouting report, Jadranka said. To the other officers waiting behind Kharid, not to him. 3 of the 10 matched Kharid's rank, yet few except the blood disturbed a man in the blood-red and nearly black-green of the Deathwatch Guard. Not that many among the blood did. According to the tales he had heard as a child, one of his ancestors, a noble, had followed Luther Peyendrag to Shanshan at Otter Hawkwing's command. But 200 years later, with only the north secure, another ancestor tried to carve out a kingdom of his own, and ended sold from the block instead. Perhaps it was so. Many Dakovale claimed noble ancestors, among themselves at least. Few of the blood found such chatter amusing. In any case, Kharid had felt lucky when the choosers picked him out, a sturdy boy, not yet old enough to be assigned duties, and he still felt pride in the ravens tattooed on his shoulders. Many Death Watch guards went without coat or shirt whenever possible to display those. The humans, anyway. Ogier gardeners were not marked or owned, but that was between them and the Empress. Karid was Dakovale, and proud of it, like every man of the guard, the property of the Crystal Throne, body and soul. He fought where the Empress pointed, and would die the day she said die. To the Empress alone did the guard answer, and where they appeared as her hand, a visible reminder of her. No wonder that some among the blood could become uneasy watching a detachment of guardsmen pass. A far better life than mucking out a lord's stables or serving cough to a lady. But he cursed the luck that had sent him into these mountains to inspect the outposts. The Rockin darted on westward. The two flyers crouched low in their saddle. There was no scouting report, no message for him. Furyk knew it was his imagination, but the creature's long, outstretched neck somehow looked anxious. Had he been anyone else, he might have been anxious too. There had been few messages for him since his orders 3 days ago to assume command and move east. Each message had thickened the fog more than cleared it. The locals, these Altarans, had moved into the mountains in force, it seemed, but how? The roads along the northern border of this range were patrolled and watched nearly to the border of Ilion by flyers and Marat Torm, as well as horse-mounted parties. What could have made the Altarans decide to show so many teeth, to stand together? The man might find himself in a duel for a look, though they had begun to learn challenging a guardsman was just a slower way of cutting your own throat. But he had seen nobles of this so-called nation trying to sell each other and their queen for the mere suggestion that their own lands might be protected and perhaps those of their neighbor added to them. Nadek, a big man with a deceptively mild face, twisted in his saddle to watch the Rockin. "I don't like mushing blind," he muttered. "Not when the Altarans have managed to put 40,000 men up here. 40 at least." Jadranka snorted so hard that his tall white gelding shifted. Jadranka was the senior of the three captains behind Karid, having served as long as Karid himself. A short, thin man with a prominent nose and such airs, you might have thought him of the blood. That horse would stand out at a mile. 40,000 or 100, Nadok. They're scattered from here to the end of the range, too far apart to support one another. Stab my eyes. Likely half are dead already. They must be tangling with outposts everywhere. That's why we aren't getting reports. We're just expected to sweep up the remnants. Karid swallowed a smile. He had hoped Jadranka was not a fool atop his airs. Praise of victors spread quickly, whether they were an army or half a banner. It was the rare defeats that were swallowed in silence and forgotten. So much silence was ominous. That last report didn't sound like remnants to me, Nadek persisted. He was no fool. There are 5,000 men, not 50 miles ahead of us, and I doubt we'll take them with brooms. Jadranka snorted again. We'll crush them with swords or brooms. The light burned my eyes. I can hardly wait for a decent engagement. I told the scouts to press on until they found them. I won't have them slipping away from us. You did what? Karid said softly. Soft or not, his words jerked every eye toward him, though Nadek and a few of the others had to struggle to stop gaping at Jadranka. Scouts told to press ahead? Scouts told what to look for? What had gone unseen for those orders? Before anyone could open his mouth, shouts rose from the men in the pass, screams, and the shrieks of horses. Karid pressed the leather tube of the looking glass to his eye. Along the pass ahead of him, men and horses were dying under a hail of what he thought must be crossbow bolts. The way they hammered through steel breastplates, exploded through chests protected by mail. Hundreds were down already, hundreds more sagging wounded in their saddles or afoot and running from horses thrashing on the ground. Too many were running. Even as he looked, men still mounted whirled their horses to try fleeing back up the pass. Where in the light were the Suldam? He could not find them. He had faced rebels who had Suldam into money, and they always had to be killed as fast as possible. Maybe the locals had learned that. Suddenly, shockingly, the ground began to erupt in roaring fountains all along the writhing snake of his command, fountains that flung men and horses into the air as easily as dirt and stones. Lightning flashed out of the sky, blue-white bolts shattering earth and men alike. Other men simply exploded, ripped to shreds by nothing he could see. Did the locals have demoni of their own? No, it would be those Aes Sedai. "What are we going to do?" Nalek said. He sounded shaken, as well he might. "Do you think to abandon your men?" Jadranka snarled. "We rally them and attack you." He cut off, gurgling, as Kharid's sword point went neatly into his throat. There were times fools could be tolerated, and times not. As the man toppled from his saddle, Kharid deftly wiped his blade on the gelding's white mane before the animal bolted. There were times for a little show, too. "We rally what can be rallied, Nadak," he said, as if Jadranka had never spoken, as if he had never been. "We save what can be saved, and fall back." Turning to ride down into the pass where lightnings flashed and thunders roared, he ordered Anghar, a steady-eyed young man with a fast horse, to ride inspired here. Perhaps a flyer would see, and perhaps Kharid suspected he knew why they flew low now. He suspected the High Lady Seroth and the generals in Ebu Dar already knew what was occurring up here too. Was today the day he died for the Empress? He dug his heels into his horse's flanks. From the flat, thinly treed ridge, Rand peered westward over the forest before him. With the power in him, life so sweet, vileness oh so vile, he could see individual leaves, but it was not enough. Tidashar stamped a hoof. The jagged peaks behind, to either side and all around, overtopped the ridge by a mile or more. But the ridge stood well above the treetops below, a rolling wooded valley over a league in length and nearly as wide. All was still down there, as quiet as the void he floated in. Quiet for the moment, anyway. Here and there plumes of smoke rose from where 2 or 3 trees in a clump burned like torches. Only the general wet stopped them turning the valley into a conflagration. Flynn and Deshiva were the only Ashaman still with him. All the rest were down in the valley. The pair stood a little way from him at the edge of the trees, holding their horses by the reins and staring at the forest below. While Flynn stared as intently as Rand himself. Deshiva glanced occasionally, twisted his mouth, sometimes muttering to himself in a way that made Flynn shift his feet and eye him sideways. The power filled both men nearly to overflowing, but for a change, Lews Therin said nothing. The man seemed increasingly to have gone back into hiding over the last few days. In the sky, there was actually sunlight, and the scattered clouds were gray. It was 5 days since Rand had brought his small army to Altara. 5 days since he had seen his first Shon-Chen dead. He had seen quite a few since. Thought slid across the surface of the void. He could feel the heron branded into his palm, pressing against the dragon scepter through his glove. Silent. There were none of the flying creatures to be seen. 3 of those had died, slashed from the sky by lightning, before their riders learned to stay clear. Bashir was fascinated by the creatures. Quiet. "Perhaps it is finished, my Lord Dragon." Ailil's voice was calm and cool, but she patted her mare's neck, though the animal did not need soothing. She eyed Flynn and Deshiva sideways and straightened, unwilling to reveal a shred of unease in front of them. Rand found himself humming and stopped abruptly. That was Lews Therin's habit, looking at a pretty woman, not his. Not his. Light if he started taking on the fellow's mannerisms, and when he was not there at that. Abruptly, hollow thunder boomed up the valley. Fire fountained out of a tree a good 2 miles away or more, then again and again, again. Lightning streaked down into the forest not far from where the tall flames had bloomed, single slashes like jagged blue-white lances, a flurry of lightning bolts and fire, and all was still again. No trees had caught fire this time. Some of that had been Sayadine, some of it. Shouts rose, dim and distant, from another part of the valley, he thought. Too far for even his Sayadine-enhanced ears to hear the crash of steel. Despite everything, not all of the fighting was being done by Ashaman and dedicated and soldiers. Anayala let out a loud breath she must have been holding since the exchange when the power began. Men fighting with steel did not disturb her. Then she patted her mount's neck. The gelding had only flickered an ear. Rand had noticed that about women. Quite often, when a woman was agitated, she tried to soothe others, whether they required soothing or not. A horse would do. Where was Luce Theron? Irritably, he leaned forward to study the forest canopy again. A good many of those trees were evergreens, oak and pine and leatherleaf, and despite the late drought, they made an effective screen, even to his intensified vision. As if idly, he touched the narrow bundle under his stirrup leather. He could take a hand and strike blindly. He could ride down into the woods and be able to see 10 paces at most. Down there, he would be a little more effective than one of the soldiers. A gateway opened among the trees a little way along the ridge, silvery slash widening into a hole that showed different trees and thick winter brown underbrush. A copper-skinned soldier with a thin mustache on his upper lip and a small pearl in his ear exited afoot and let the gateway vanish. He was shoving a suldam ahead of him, with her wrists tied behind her, a handsome woman except for the purple knot on the side of her head. That seemed to go along with her scowl, though, as well as it did with her rumpled, leaf-stained dress. She sneered over her shoulder at the soldier while he pushed her along the ridgetop to Rand, and then she sneered up at Rand. The soldier stiffened, saluting smartly. "Soldier Arlen Nalam, my Lord Dragon," he barked, staring straight at Rand's saddle. "My Lord Dragon's orders were to bring any women captured to him." Rand nodded. It was only to give him the appearance of doing something, inspecting prisoners to be sure they were what any idiot could see they were. "Take her back to the carts, Soldier Nalam. Then return to the fighting." He almost ground his teeth saying that. Return to the fighting. While Randolph Thor, Dragon Reborn and King of Ilion, sat his horse and watched treetops. Nalam saluted again before pushing away the woman ahead of him, but he was not slow about it. She kept peering over her shoulder again, yet not at the soldier this time. At Rand, with wide-eyed, open-mouthed astonishment. For some reason, Nalam did not pull her to a halt until he reached the spot where he had come out. All that was necessary was to go far enough to avoid injuring the horses. "What are you doing?" Rand demanded as Sayadine filled the man. Nalam half turned back to him, hesitating briefly. "It seems easier here. If I use a place, I've already made a gateway, my Lord Dragon. Sayadine feels strange to me here." His prisoner turned to frown at him. After a moment, Rand gestured him to go ahead. Flynn pretended to be interested in his horse's saddle girth, but the balding old man smiled faintly, smugly. Dashiva giggled. Flynn had been the first to mention an odd feel to Sayadine in this valley. Of course, Narishma and Hopwell had heard him, and Moore added his tales of the strangeness around Abu Dar. Small wonder everyone was claiming to feel something now, though not a one could say what. Sayadine just felt peculiar. Light, with a taint thick on the male half of the source. What else would it feel? Rand hoped they were not all coming down with his new sickness. Nalam's gateway opened and vanished behind him and his prisoner. Rand let himself really feel Sayadine. Life and corruption commingled, ice to make winter's heart seem warm, and fire to make a forge's flames cold. Death waiting for him to slip. Wanting him to slip. It did not feel any different, did it? He scowled at where Nalam had disappeared, Nalam and the woman. She was the fourth Suldam taken this afternoon. That made 23 Suldam prisoners with the carts. And 2 Damani, each still in her silvery leash and collar, carried on separate carts. In those collars, they could not walk 3 steps before becoming more violently sick than Rand did, seizing the source. He was not sure the sisters with Matt would be pleased to receive them after all. The first Damani, 3 days before, he had not thought of as a prisoner. A slender woman with pale yellow hair and big blue eyes, she was a Shan-Chan captive to be freed, he thought. But when he forced a Suldam to remove the woman's collar, her Adam, she screamed for the Suldam to help her and immediately began lashing out with the power. She had even offered her neck for the Suldam to replace the thing. 9 defenders and a soldier died before she could be shielded. Gedwin would have killed her on the spot had Rand not stopped it. The defenders, nearly as uncomfortable around women who could channel as others were around men who could, the defenders still wanted her dead. They had taken casualties in the fighting these past days, but having men killed by a prisoner seemed to offend them. There had been more casualties than Rand had expected. 31 defenders dead and 46 companions. More than 200 among the Legion men and the nobles' armsmen. 7 soldiers and a dedicated, men Rand had never met before they answered his summons to Ilion. Too many, considering that all except the gravest injury could be healed, if a man could only hang on until there was time. But he was driving the Shan-Chan west, driving them hard. More shouting rose somewhere far off down in the valley. Fire blossomed a good 3 miles to the west, and lightning struck, toppling trees. Trees and stone erupted from a mountainside farther on, strange fountains marching along the slope. The roaring booms swallowed shouts. The Shan-Chan were retreating. "Get down there," Rand told Flynn and Deshiva. "Both of you. Find Gedwin and tell him I said push! Push!" Deshiva grimaced at the forest below, then began awkwardly tugging his horse along the ridge. The man was ungainly with horses, riding or leading. He nearly tripped over his sword. Flynn looked up at Rand worriedly. "You mean to stay here alone, my Lord Dragon?" "I'm hardly alone," Rand said dryly, glancing at Ailil and Anayla. They had ridden back to their armsmen, almost 200 lancers waiting just short of where the ridge began to slope down to the east. At their head, Den Harid frowned through the face bars of his helmet. He had command of both lots now, and if his concern was for Ailil and Anayla, his fellows still made a show fit to keep away most attackers. Besides, Wyraman had the northern end of this ridge secured so a fly could not pass, he claimed, and Bashir held the south. Without boasting, Bashir just erected a wall of lances without talking about it. And the Shan-Chan were retreating. "And I'm hardly helpless anyway, Flynn." Flynn actually looked doubtful and scratched his fringe of white hair before saluting and leading his horse toward where Deshiva's gateway was already winking out. Limping along, Flynn shook his head, muttering to himself, fit for Deshiva. Rand wanted to snarl. He could not go mad, and neither could they. Flynn's gateway vanished, and Rand returned to his study of the treetops. It was quiet again, time stretched in stillness. This notion of taking the outposts in the mountains had been a bad one. He was willing to admit that now. In this terrain, you could be half a mile from any army without knowing it. In those tangled woods down there, you could be 10 feet from them without knowing. He needed to face the Shan-Chan on better ground. He needed... Abruptly, he was fighting Saidin, fighting wild urges that tried to ream out his skull. The void was vanishing, melting beneath the onslaught. Frantic, dazed, he released the source before it could kill him. Nausea twisted his middle. Double vision showed him 2 crowns of swords. Lying on the thick mulch of dead leaves in front of his face. He was on the ground. He could not seem to breathe properly and struggled to suck in air. There was a chip broken off one of the crown's golden laurel leaves, and blood stained several of the tiny golden sword points. A knot of hot pain in his side told him those never-healing wounds had broken open. He tried to push himself up and cried out. In stunned amazement, he stared at the dark fletchings of an arrow stuck through his right arm. With a groan, he collapsed. Something ran down his face. Something dripped in front of his eye. Blood. Vaguely, he became aware of ululating cries. Horsemen appeared among the trees to the north, galloping along the ridge, some with lowered lances, some working short bows as fast as they could knock and draw. Horsemen in blue and yellow armor of overlapping plates and helmets like huge insects' heads. Shonchan. Several hundred of them, it seemed. From the north. So much for Wyraman's fly. Rand struggled to reach the source. Too late to worry about sicking up or falling on his face. Another time he might have laughed at that. He struggled. It was like fumbling for a pin in the dark with numbed fingers. "Time to die," Lews Therin whispered. Rand had always known Lews Therin would be there at the end. Not 50 paces from Rand, screaming Tyrans and Karienan plowed into the Shonchan. "Fight, you dogs!" Anila shrieked, swinging down from her saddle beside him. "Fight!" The willow lady in her silks and laces hurled a string of curses that would have made a wagon driver's tongue go dry. Anila stood holding her mount's reins, glaring from the mill of men in steel to Rand. It was Eilil who turned him onto his back. Kneeling there, she looked down at him with an unreadable expression in her big dark eyes. He could not seem to move. He felt drained. He was not sure he could blink. Screams and the clash of steel rang in his ears. "If he dies in our hands, Bashir will hang both of us." Anila certainly was not simpering now. "If those black-coated monsters get hold of us..." She shuddered and bent closer to Eilil, gesturing with a belt knife he had not noticed in her hand before. A ruby sparkled blood red on the hilt. "Your lance captain could break off enough men to get us away. We could be miles away before he's found, and back to our estates by the time..." "I think he can hear us," Eilil broke in calmly. Her red-gloved hands moved at her waist, sheathing a belt knife or drawing one. "If he dies here..." She cut off as sharply as the other woman had, and her head jerked around. Hooves thundered past Rand on either side in thick streams, galloping north toward the Shonchan. Sword in hand, Bashir barely reined in before leaping from his saddle. Gregor and Panar dismounted more slowly, but he waved his sword at the men flooding by. "Strike home for King and Ilion!" he shouted. "Strike home! The Lord of the Morning! The Lord of the Morning!" The crash of steel rose higher, and the screaming. "It would be like this at the last of it," Bashir growled, favoring the two women with suspicious glares. He wasted only an instant, though, before raising his voice above the din of the battle. "More! Burn your Ashaman hide! Here! Now!" He did not shout that the Lord Dragon was down, thank the light. With an effort, Rand turned his head perhaps a hand. Enough to see Ilianers and Saldeans driving on north. The Shonchan must have given way. "More!" The name roared through Bashir's mustaches, and Moore himself dropped from a galloping horse nearly on top of Anila. She looked disgruntled at the lack of an apology as the man knelt beside Rand, scrubbing dark hair out of his face. She moved back quickly enough when she realized he intended to channel, though, practically bounding away. Eilil was much smoother about rising, but not noticeably slower in stepping clear. And she slipped a silver-handled belt knife back into its sheath at her waist. Healing was a simple matter, if not exactly comfortable. The fletchings were broken off, and the arrow drawn the rest of the way through with a sharp jerk that brought a gasp to Rand's lips. But that was just to clear the way. Dirt and lightly embedded fragments would fall away as flesh knit itself up, but only Flynn and a few others could use the power to remove what was driven deep. Resting two fingers on Rand's chest, Moore caught his tongue between his teeth with a fixed expression and wove healing. That was how he always did it. It did not work for him otherwise. It was not the complex weaves that Flynn used. Few could manage that, and none as well as Flynn so far. This was simpler, rougher. Waves of heat rushed through Rand, strong enough to make him grunt and send sweat gushing from every pore. He quivered violently from head to foot. A roast in the oven must have felt that way. The sudden flood of heat ebbed slowly, and Rand lay panting. In his head, Lews Therin panted too. "Kill him! Kill him!" Over and over. Muting the voice to a faint buzz, Rand thanked Moore. The young man blinked as if surprised, then grabbed the dragon scepter from the ground and forced himself to his feet. Erect, he swayed slightly. Bashir started to offer an arm, then backed away at a gesture. Rand could stand unaided. Barely. He could as soon have flown by waving his arms as channeled, though. When he touched his side, his shirt slipped on blood, yet the old round scar and the newer slash across it merely felt tender. Half-healed only, but they had never been better than that since he got them. For a moment, he studied the two women. Anila murmured something vaguely congratulatory and offered him a smile that made him wonder whether she intended to lick his wrist. Ailil stood very straight, very cool, as if nothing had happened. Had they meant to leave him to die? Or to kill him? But if so, why send their armsmen charging in and rush to check on him? On the other hand, Ailil had drawn her knife once the talk of him dying began. Most of the Saldeans and Ilianers were galloping north or riding down the slope of the ridge, pursuing the last of the Shonchan. And then Wyraman appeared from the north, riding a tall, glossy black at a slow canter that picked up when he saw Rand. His armsmen rode in double file at his back. "My lord, dragon," the High Lord intoned as he dismounted. He still seemed as clean as he had in Ilion. Bashir simply looked rumpled and a bit grimy here and there, but Gregorin's finery was decidedly dirt-stained and slashed down one sleeve besides. Wyraman flourished a bow to shame a king's court. "Forgive me, my lord dragon. I thought I saw Shonchan advancing in front of the ridge and went to meet them. I never suspected this other company. You can't know how it would pain me if you were injured." "I think I know," Rand said dryly, and Wyraman blinked. Shonchan advancing? Perhaps. Wyraman would always snatch at a chance for glory in the charge. "What did you mean at the last, Bashir?" "They're pulling back," Bashir replied. In the valley, fire and lightning erupted for a moment, as if to give him the lie, but nearly to the far end. "Your scouts do say they all do be retreating," Gregorin said, rubbing his beard, and gave Moore a sidelong, uncomfortable glance. Moore grinned at him toothily. Rand had seen the Ilianer in the thick of fighting, heading his men, shouting encouragement and laying his sword about with wild abandon. But he flinched at Moore's grin. Gedwin strode up then, leading his horse carelessly, insolently. He almost sneered at Bashir and Gregorin, frowned at Wyraman as if already knowing the man's blunder, and eyed Ailil and Anila as though he might pinch them. The two women drew back from him hastily, but then so did the men, except for Bashir. Even more. Gedwin's salute to Rand was a casual tap of fist to chest. "I sent scouts out as soon as I saw this lot was done. There are 3 more columns inside 10 miles. "All headed west," Bashir put in quietly, but he looked at Gedwin sharp enough to slice stone. "You've done it," he told Rand. "They're all falling back. I doubt they'll stop short of Abu Dar. Campaigns don't always end with a grand march into the city, and this one is finished." Surprisingly, or perhaps not, Wyraman began arguing for an advance to "take Abu Dar for the glory of the Lord of the Morning," as he put it. But it was certainly a shock to hear Gedwin say he would not mind taking a few more swipes at these Shonchan, and he certainly would not mind seeing Abu Dar. Even Ailil and Anila added their voices in favor of putting an end to the Shonchan once and for all, though Ailil did add that she would as soon like to avoid having to return to finish. She was quite sure the Lord Dragon would insist on her company for it. That in a tone as cool and dry as night in the Aiel waste. Only Bashir and Gregorin spoke for turning back, and raised their voices they did increasingly as Rand stood silent. Silent and staring west, toward Abu Dar. "We did do what we came for," Gregorin insisted. "Light's mercy. Do you think to take Abu Dar itself?" Take Abu Dar, Rand thought. Why not? No one expected that. A total surprise for the Shonchan and everybody else. "Times are you seize the advantage and ride on," Bashir growled. "Other times you take your winnings and go home. I say it's time to go home." I would not mind you in my head, Luz Theron said, sounding almost sane, if you were not so clearly mad. Abu Dar. Rand tightened his hand on the dragon scepter, and Luz Theron cackled. Chapter 24. A Time for Iron. A dozen leagues east of Abu Dar, Rakan glided in and out of the cloud-streaked sunrise to land in a long pasture marked as the Flyers' Field by colored streamers on tall poles. The brown grasses had been trampled and scored days since. All of the creatures' grace in the air was lost as soon as their claws touched the ground in a lumbering run, leathery pinions 30 paces or more wide held high as if the animal wanted to sweep itself back upward. There was little beauty either in the Rakan that ran awkwardly down the field, beating ribbed wings, Flyers crouching in the saddle as if to pull the beast up by main force, ran on until at last they stumbled into the air, wingtips barely clearing the tops of the olive trees at the end of the field. Only as they gained height and turned toward the sun, soared toward the clouds, did the Rakan regain dignified grandeur. Flyers who landed did not bother to dismount. While a groundling held a basket up for the Rakan to gulp whole shriveled fruits by the double handful at a time, one of the Flyers would hand down their scouting report to a still more senior groundling, and the other bent on the other side to receive new orders from a Flyer too senior to handle reins personally very often. Almost that quickly after coming to a halt, the creature was reined around to waddle over to where 4 or 5 others waited their turn to make that long, ungainly run to the sky. At a dead run, dodging between moving formations of cavalry and infantry, messengers carried the scouting reports to the huge red-bannered command tent. There were haughty Tarabonner lancers and stolid Amadisian pikemen in well-ordered squares, breastplates striped horizontally in the colors of the regiments they were attached to. Altaran light horse, in disordered bunches, made their mounts prance, vain of the red slashes crisscrossing their chests, so different from the markings anyone else wore. The Altarans did not know those indicated irregulars of doubtful reliability. Among the Shonchan soldiers, named regiments with proud honors were represented from every corner of the empire. Pale-eyed men from Alkam, honey-brown men from Enkon, men black as coal from Koial and Dalanshar. There were Marat Torm on their sinuous, bronze-scaled mounts that made horses wicker and dance in fright, and even a few Marat Grolm with their squat, beak-mouthed charges. But one thing that always accompanied a Shonchan army was conspicuous by its absence. The Suldam and Damani were still in their tents. Captain General Kenameraj thought of the Suldam and Damani a great deal. From his seat on the dais, he could see the map table clearly, where helmetless underlieutenants checked the reports and placed markers to represent the forces in the field. A small paper banner stood above each marker, inked symbols giving the size and composition of the force. Finding decent maps in these lands was next to impossible, but the map copied atop the large table was sufficient, and worrying in what it told him. Black discs for outposts overrun were dispersed. Far too many of those, dotting the whole eastern half of the Venir Range. Red wedges for commands on the move marked the western end as thickly, all pointed back toward Abu Dar. And scattered among the black discs, 17 stark white. As he watched, a young officer in the brown and black of a Marat Torm carefully placed an 18th. Enemy forces. A few might be the same group seen twice, but for the most part, they were much too far apart. The timing of the sightings wrong. Along the walls of the tent, clerks in plain brown coats, marked only with insignia of rank among clerks on the wide collars, waited at their writing tables, pens in hand, for Mirage to issue orders that they would copy out for distribution. He had already given what orders he could. There were as many as 90,000 enemy soldiers in the mountains, nearly twice what he could muster here, even with the native levies. Too many for belief, except that scouts did not lie. Liars had their throats slit by their fellows. Too many, springing out of the ground like trapworms in the Centajor. At least they had 100 miles of mountain yet to cover if they intended to threaten Abu Dar. Almost 200 for the white discs furthest east. and hill country after that for another 100 miles. Surely the enemy general could not mean to let his dispersed forces be confronted one by one. Gathering them together would take more time. Time alone was on his side right then. The entry flaps of the tent swept open, and the High Lady Suroth glided in, black hair a proud crest spilling down her back, pleated snow-white gown and richly embroidered overrobe somehow untouched by the mud outside. He had thought her still in Ebu Dar. She must have flown out by Torakan. She was accompanied by a small entourage, for her. A pair of Death Watch guards with black tassels on their sword hilts held the tent flaps, and more were visible outside. Stone-faced men in red and green. The embodiment of the Empress, might she live forever. Even the blood took note of them. Suroth sailed past as if they were as much servants as the lushly bodied Dakavale in slippers and a nearly transparent white robe, her honey-yellow hair in a multitude of thin braids, who carried the High Lady's gilded writing desk a meek 2 paces behind. Suroth's voice of the blood Alwyn, a glowering woman in green robes with the left side of her head shaved and the remainder of her pale brown hair in a severe braid, followed close on her mistress's heels. As Mirage stepped down from the dais, he realized with shock that the second Dakavali behind Suroth, short and dark-haired and slim in her diaphanous robe, was Damani. A Damani garbed as property was unheard of, but odder still, it was Alwyn who led her by the Edam. He let none of his amazement show as he went to one knee, murmuring, "The light be upon the High Lady Suroth. All honor to the High Lady Suroth." Everyone else prostrated themselves on the canvas ground cloth, eyes down. Mirage was of the blood, if too low to shave the sides of his scalp like Suroth. Only the nails of his little fingers were lacquered, much too low to register surprise if a High Lady allowed her voice to continue acting as Suldam after being raised to the Sojin. Strange times in a strange land, where the Dragon Reborn walked, and Marath Damani ran wild to kill and enslave where they would. Suroth barely glanced at him before turning to study the map table, and if her black eyes tightened at what she saw, she had cause. Under her, the Hylian had done far more than had been dreamed, reclaiming great stretches of the stolen lands. All they had been sent for was to scout the way, and after Falma, some had thought even that impossible. She drummed fingers on the table irritably, the long blue-lacquered fingernails on the first 2 clicking. Continued success, and she might be able to shave her head entirely and paint a 3rd nail on each hand. Adoption into the imperial family was not unheard of for achievements so great. And if she stepped too far, overstepped, she might find her fingernails clipped and herself stuffed into a filmy robe to serve one of the blood, if not sold to a farmer to help till his fields, or sweat in a warehouse. At worst, Mirage would only have to open his own veins. He continued to watch Suroth in patient silence, but he had been a scout lieutenant, Morat Rakan, before being raised to the blood, and he could not help being aware of everything around him. A scout lived or died by what he saw or did not, and so did others. The men lying on their faces around the tent, some hardly seemed to breathe. Suroth should have taken him aside and let them continue with their work. A messenger was being turned back by the soldiers at the entrance. How dire was the message that the woman tried to push past Death Watch guards. The Dakavali with the writing desk in her arms caught his eye. Scowls flashed across her pretty doll's face, never pushed down for more than moments. Property showing anger? And there was something else. His gaze flickered to the Damani, who stood with her head down, but still looked around with curiosity. Brown-eyed Dakavale and pale-eyed Damani looked about as different as 2 women could, yet there was something about them, something in their faces. Strange. He could not have said how old either was. Quick as his glance was, Alwyn noticed. With a twitch of the Adam's silvery leash, she put the Damani face down on the ground cloth. Snapping her fingers, she pointed to the canvas with a hand not encumbered by the Adam's bracelet, then grimaced when the honey-haired Dakavali did not move. "Down, Leandrin," she hissed almost under her breath. With a glare for Alwyn, A glare, the Duckavali sank to her knees, features painted with sulkiness. Most strange, but hardly important. Face impassive and otherwise bursting with impatience, he waited. Impatience and no little discomfort. He had been raised to the blood after riding 50 miles in a single night with 3 arrows in him to bring word of a rebel army marching on Shandar itself, and his back still pained him. Finally, Siroth turned from the map table. She did not give him leave to rise, much less embrace him as one of the blood. Not that he had expected that. He was far beneath her. "You are ready to march?" she demanded curtly. At least she did not speak to him through her voice. Before so many of his officers, the shame would have put his eyes on the ground for months, if not years. "I will, Siroth," he replied calmly, meeting her gaze. He was of the blood, however low. "They cannot combine in fewer than 10 days, with at least another 10 before they can exit the mountains. Well before then, They could be here tomorrow," she snapped. "Today. If they come, Mirage, they will come by the ancient art of traveling, and it seems very possible that they will come." He heard men shifting on their bellies before they could restrain themselves. Siroth lost control of her emotions and babbled of legends. "Are you certain?" The words popped out of his mouth before he could stop them. He had only thought she had lost control before. Her eyes blazed. She gripped the edges of her flower-worked robe, white-knuckled, and her hands shook. "Do you question me?" she snarled incredulously. "Suffice it that I have my sources of information." And was furious with them as much as with him, he realized. "If they come, there will be perhaps as many as 50 of these grandly named Ashaman, but no more than 5,000 or 6,000 soldiers. It seems there have been no more since the beginning, whatever the flyers say." Mirage nodded slowly. 5,000 men moved about in some way with the one power would explain a great deal. What were her sources that she knew numbers so precisely? He was not fool enough to ask. She certainly had listeners and seekers in her service, watching her too. 50 Ashaman. The very idea of a man channeling made him want to spit in disgust. Rumor claimed that they were being gathered from every nation by the Dragon Reborn, this Randalthor, but he had never expected there could be so many. The Dragon Reborn could channel, it was said. That might be true, but he was the Dragon Reborn. The prophecies of the dragon had been known in Shonchan even before Luther Payandrag began the consolidation. In corrupted form, it was said, much different from the pure version Luther Payandrag brought. Mirage had seen several volumes of the Koreathon cycle printed in these lands, and they were corrupted too. Not one mentioned him serving the Crystal Throne, but the prophecies held men's minds and hearts still. More than a few hoped the return came soon, but these lands could be reclaimed before Tarmangaden, so the Dragon Reborn could win the last battle for the glory of the Empress, might she live forever. The Empress surely would want Althor sent to her, so she could see what sort of man served her. There would be no difficulty with Althor once he had knelt to her. Few easily shook off the awe they felt, kneeling before the Crystal Throne, with the thirst to obey drying their tongues. But it seemed obvious that bundling the fellow onto a ship would be easier if disposing of the Ashaman, they had to be disposed of, certainly, waited until Althor was well on his way across the Arath Ocean to Shandar. Which brought him back to the problem he had been trying to avoid, he realized with an inward start. He was not a man to shy from difficulties, much less ignore them blindly, but this was different from any he had faced before. He had fought in 24 battles with Damani used on both sides. He knew the way of them. It was not only a matter of striking out with the power. Experienced Suldam could somehow see what Damani or Marath Damani did, and Damani would tell the others so they could defend as well. Could Suldam see what a man did, too? Worse, you will release the Suldam and the money to me, he said. Taking a deep breath in spite of himself, he added, if they're still sick, it will be a short fight and bloody on our side. Which produced another stir among the men waiting on their faces. Every second rumor in the camp was about what illness had confined the Suldam and Damani to their tents. Alwyn reacted quite openly, most improper in a Sojin, with a furious glare. The Damani flinched again and began to shiver where she lay. Oddly, the honey-haired Dakavali flinched as well. Smiling, Siroth glided to where the Dakavali knelt. Why would she smile at a poorly trained serving girl? She began stroking the kneeling woman's thin braids, and a sullen pout appeared on that rosebud mouth. A former noblewoman of these lands? Siroth's first words supported that, though obviously meant for him. Small failures bring small costs. Great failures bring painfully great costs. You will have the money you require, Mirage, and you will teach these Ashaman they should have remained in the north. You will wipe them from the face of the earth. The Ashaman, the soldiers, all of them. To the man, Mirage. I have spoken. It will be as you say, Siroth, he replied. They will be destroyed. To the man. There was nothing else he could say now. He wished, though, that she had given him an answer about whether the Suldam and the money were still sick. Rand reined Tidashar around near the crest of the bare, stony hill to watch most of his small army spilling out of other holes in the air. He held hard to the true source, so hard it seemed to tremble in his grasp. With the power in him, the sharp points of the crown of swords pricking his temples felt at once keener than ever and utterly removed, the mid-morning chill both colder and beneath notice. The never-healing wounds in his side were a dull and distant ache. Luce Theron seemed to be panting in uncertainty, or perhaps fear. Maybe after coming so close to death the day before, he did not want so much to die anymore. But then, he did not always want to die. The only constant in the man was the desire to kill, which just happened to include killing himself often enough. They'll be killing enough for anybody soon, Rand thought. Like the last 6 days were enough to sicken a vulture. Had it only been 6 days. The disgust did not touch him, though. He would not let it. Luce Theron did not answer. Yes. It was a time for iron hearts, and iron stomachs, too. He bent a moment to touch the long, cloth-wrapped package under his stirrup leather. No, not time yet. Maybe not at all. Uncertainty shimmered across the void, and maybe something else. Not at all, he hoped. Uncertainty, yes, but the other half had not been fear. It had not. Half the surrounding low hills were covered with squat, gnarled olive trees, dappled by the sunlight, where lancers already rode along the rows to make sure they were clear. There was no sign of workers in those orchards, no farmhouse, no structure of any kind in sight. A few miles to the west, the hills were darker, forested. Legion men, emerging in trotting files below Rand, formed up, trailed by a ragged square of Ilianer volunteers, now enlisted into the Legion. As soon as their ranks were aligned, they marched out of the way to make room for defenders and companions. The ground seemed mostly clay, and boots and hooves alike skidded in the thin skim of mud. For a wonder, though, only a few clouds hung in the sky, white and clean. The sun was a pale yellow ball, and nothing flew up there larger than a sparrow. Deshiva and Flynn were among the men holding gateways, as were Adley and Hopwell, Moore and Narishma. Some of the gateways lay out of Rand's sight, behind the folded hills. He wanted everyone through as quickly as possible, and except for a few soldiers scanning the sky, every man in a black coat who was not already out scouting held a weave. Even Gedwin and Rothschild, though both grimaced over it, at each other and in his direction. Rand thought them no longer used to doing anything so common as holding a gateway for others to use. Bashir cantered up the slope, very much at ease with himself and with his short bay. His cloak was flung back despite the morning's coolness, not so cold as the mountains, but still wintry. He nodded casually to Anayala and Ailil, who gave bleak stares in return. Bashir smiled through those thick mustaches like down-curving horns, a not entirely pleasant smile. He had as many doubts of the women as Rand did. The women knew, about Bashir's reservations at least. Turning her head quickly from the Saldaean, Anayala returned to stroking her gelding's mane. Ailil held her reins too rigidly. That pair had not strayed far from Rand since the incident on the ridge, even having their tents pitched in earshot of his the night before. On a brown grass hillside opposite, Denhar had shifted to study the two noblewomen's retainers, arrayed together behind him, then quickly returned to watching Rand. Very likely he watched.
All right, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. I got to get up a little early to go fishing with my brother tonight, or in the morning. So, I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone keep stopping by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Excuse me. Until next time, y'all stay safe.